Hi there. Thank you very much for joining me today. Hopefully you can hear me all loud and clear coming through, and you can also see the employment law changes slide up on the screen there today. So I can see we've already got several people dialed into this webinar, and we might give people a couple more minutes just to get online. And while we do so, I'll just talk you through a couple of the features of this webinar. So it's talking about the recent employment law changes, which you might have seen on the news over the past few weeks. And so with that, during the session, if you do have any questions, feel free to just reach out with those. So there is actually a Q&A box, which you should see as one of the functions on your screen. Sometimes it pops up if you just roll your mouse around the screen, depending on which setup you've got at your end. And so there's also a box on there marked chat, so you can use the chat box too for any comments or questions in there. And so I'll periodically be checking in on those just to see what's coming through. And at the end, there's also going to be another option for questions. So you can choose to hold them over to the end of our session today if you like, or ask them right up front. So I'm just getting a little bit of background noise at my end, so I'll just sort things out here and then we'll make a start in just a moment. Okay then, so let's take a look at the employment law changes, and this is very much written from a small business standpoint. So the guidance given on the session today is tailored and on the understanding that most of you are probably either running a small business or just about to launch a small business, and perhaps you already have employees, or perhaps this is something that you're looking to embark on in the near future. Okay, so before I get started, where I'm actually located today is in Perth, or Boorloo in Western Australia. And so with that, I like to do an acknowledgement of country in language. And with the Whadjuk Noongar nation here in Perth, I'll be using the Noongar dialect. So Nala Kadich, Nitcha Buja, Whadjuk Noongar Buja, Bal Demam Debem, Kurayeye, Border Yirakul. So we know and understand this is Whadjuk Noongar country of their grandmothers, grandfathers, past, present, and those rising up. Gala Kadich, Nala Nail Bal Bordakul, Bal Kadajini, Bal Genuini, Nichabuja Kumba. So we know and we listen to the future journey of their knowledge and how they'll continue to look over their many countries and lands. Okay, so looking on through the presentation today, to just give you a little bit of background around myself, I'm Pauline, and I've been a Business Station advisor now for, I think it's nearly 4 years actually, so helping small businesses around the nation, predominantly around the people and culture space. So if there's any tricky people issues in the workplace, also looking at around the compliance side of things. And and I've been running my small business now for 10 years coming up in the next couple of months, which is a really great milestone to have in place. And so myself and my team provide general HR guidance, talent acquisition around the recruitment and onboarding space, workplace investigations, mediations, workshop facilitation, just like this webinar today, and also keynote speaking at conferences and events. So the platform that I'm talking from today involves experience in Australia over many, many years in the HR space, and prior to that in the UK, which you might hear from the accent here today, and many formal accreditations and courses over the years. So you know that this isn't just something that I've been reading off a news site. This is actually something that a lot of research has gone into to make sure you're getting the most up-to-date and most accurate information. So let's take a look at how these new laws measure up. And as we do, just a little warning here that I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. There's been a lot of effort that's gone into making sure the most accurate information is presented to you today, but it is very general in its guidance. And so there may be specific, unique elements to your workplace, your situation, your organisation. And so that's where getting one-on-one advice is a much better situation if you do have any really big, gnarly issues that you'd like to look at. So one of the big new things that's come out, and in part due to the big Me Too movement that's been coming through over recent years, with many claims of sexual harassment and many of a criminal nature that have involved many court cases, often involving some quite high-profile individuals. This is all culminated in this groundswell of support for making change, making workplaces more safer for people. And a lot of the reports that have come up have been around the misconduct of males towards females, but of course also acknowledging that it can span others. I've had a small number of reverse situations happening where women have been harassing men in the workplace, and also a small number of similarly gendered people having issues there too. So the big area here to look at is looking at your workplace culture. So if you are in a workplace where there is a sexually charged environment, and that can happen when there's a big amount of a particular gender, or perhaps a tolerance of certain behaviours in the workplace. And so banter is often seen as something that, oh, this just makes the workplace fun. But often humour can actually be used as a disguise to inappropriate behaviours in the workplace. And, oh, you know, I was only joking when I touched this person like in this way, or said this certain thing in this way. But jokes are not something that are acknowledged by the Fair Work system. It's more around upholding good standards of conduct. And that's where in your organisations, be it that you're bringing on your first employee or you've already got employees, when people are coming on board, making sure that there's a good induction in place that talks about respectable behaviours, talks about what isn't appropriate in the workplace. With that, it's something that really does pay off, because not only can you go to Fair Work going, we did everything we could, we had a policy, we talked to people about this, and they still screwed up. If you haven't done any of that, then it makes it harder for you to actually take steps with people. And also by informing people up front, hopefully that does adjust behaviour. But of course, if it hasn't, then you can say, well, we've already made it clear what we were expecting, and you have failed to keep your end of the bargain in terms of the employment relationship. And the sorts of things that are inappropriate in the workplace, and this legislation has made it more overt. Any dodgy calendars, and there's often a few that might be going up in workplaces. The Perth firemen tend to do a roaring trade on their calendar this year, and some of the shots on there, you might kind of go, well, is this really bringing the professional tone that we want in our workplace? If people really love that sort of thing, maybe they pop it up at home. And the same with some of the scantily clad lady calendars that tend to be around. That sort of display of information in the workplace, of graphics in the workplace, is not appropriate, even if it is in the bloke's toilet, even if it is in the workshop where there's no women working. Doesn't matter. It's all setting a tone for your workplace. And in a workplace, it's all about the standards you walk past are the standards you accept. So if you walk by and you're ignoring the dodgy calendar every day or having a laugh about it, it's seen as you as a leader in your business are actually condoning that sort of behaviour, even though personally you might not like it. So it is important to take action there. And taking action if you might hear things going on, if there's any offensive jokes going on, if there's any sexualised banter, those sorts of things, there's an opportunity in that moment to cut it off. There's some great research that's actually come out in the past couple of years that talks about inappropriate behaviours in the workplace can be stopped in 9 seconds. So as soon as they're heard, if someone cuts in going, yeah, I really don't, I think you should rephrase that. I think that the tone of that was delivered in a way that could have been better, really sort of taking people, giving people that opportunity to reflect. And if it was something really serious, then potentially taking some form of disciplinary action with people. Okay. So, respect at work, and particularly for people in Western Australia, over the Christmas holidays, the McGowan government has gifted us psychosocial safety elements in the workplace to ensure that we uphold. So, sexual harassment is actually recognised now as a psychosocial hazard. A psychosocial hazard is something that can impact people's mental health in a detrimental manner. And so this could be where there's a lot of work pressure due to heavy workloads, due to working excessive hours, inappropriate behaviours, unfairness in the workplace, sexual harassment, of course. If there's very monotonous work, if there's dangerous work where people are having to be on a high level of vigilance at all times, or if there's trauma involved in that work, then those are all elements around psychosocial hazards. And there's similar legislation around the nation now. And there's some really good resources on Safe Work Australia on the website there. So if you want to have a look, and there's industry specific resources, which are fantastic as well. So if you're running a florist shop, or you're running an engineering company, or you're running a construction company, whatever it might be, then there's general guidance that's in there that is much more specific to the types of hazards likely to be faced in your industry. And with the legislation coming over Christmas in Western Australia, and that exists in other parts of the nation, there is an obligation on employers to act. So if there is a high risk that's identified in the workplace, there's an obligation to take reasonable and proportionate measures to prevent this from occurring. And so that could be, if you've got someone who's sexually harassing your staff, your reasonable and proportionate measure may be that that person's employment is terminated. It has to be done in the right kind of way. And there's some awesome resources on the Fair Work website around that. There's this whole small business showcase, which has a whole heap of information across all of the HR elements within a business. And it's always a great place to start looking, and that can set you up for initial success, and then reaching out to qualified professionals where you might need a bit of extra guidance, or even someone to sit in on a meeting with you just to make sure everything's all done properly. And reasonable and proportionate measures will depend on your organisation. So if you're a Rio Tinto of the world, the expectations will be much higher than a small business, because you're unlikely to have that same budget to be able to deal with certain things. But there are some things that you can do to help with psychological and psychosocial safety in the workplace. And one of it can be as simple as communicating every couple of months with employees to go, here's some great crisis support numbers. Here is the details for getting in contact with Lifeline, Beyond Blue, and maybe there's some others that are applicable to your area. If you've got a lot of parents, then Panda is a great one. There's also, if you've got young people, Headspace, and all sorts of other different potential providers. So you don't have to go to the cost of providing counselling, but if you do have an employee assistance program, EAP, or counselling set up, that's fantastic and really can help avoid some risk in this area. But if you're not at that stage yet, then there are free national support services that you can actually communicate with your staff to reduce that risk. Now, some of the ways that you can also offer support to people is within the workplace, where issues are raised, making sure that they're tackled straight away. Otherwise, you've got potential liability issues as an employer from your duty of care perspective. It's really important that you've got some strong policies and procedures in place. Having something is better than nothing. So even if you've just got some ideas and you just want to talk about respectful behaviour, getting something out there while you actually refine things, or maybe even getting somebody to have an overview of those policies and procedures after that is a good idea. Monitoring data, and of course in smaller organisations that might just be from conversations that you have, whereas larger organisations might actually run psychosocial safety surveys in the workplace. Training is another good element in here. And so again, that induction training is important. And also there might be re-education or educational sessions that you have after that. That could be in response to an incident where perhaps it's noticed that the level of banter in the workplace just strays into inappropriate territory too much of the time. And there's some great free resources out there. They say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but here there's some resources for you today. There's a great company in Perth called Equal Opportunity Specialists. And so they've actually got a website here. So feel free to scan this QR code. You will get a recording of this session actually afterwards. And so you can always go back on here now, but feel free. This is one of those sessions where it's good to have your mobile phone with you and switched on. Just so that you can actually scan through this, because I've got a couple more helpful QR codes as we go through. There's 10 steps that you can take in a workplace to reduce your risk of liability around this respect at work legislation and the expectations. And of course, this isn't new, this respect at work. There's some new elements, but looking at sexual harassment in the workplace, that's actually been outlawed for many, many years. So the posters you can display in your workplace, great way of taking one of your 10 reasonable steps. Other reasonable steps to help in the workplace include the ones mentioned on the previous slide around having strong policies, training, so on and so forth from there. Okay, so now I am assuming that most of you on this call today are either already a constitutional corporation, so you fall under the Fair Work Act, or you're likely to be heading that way at some point. There are a few exceptions. So, for example, if you're in Western Australia and you are running a business that is a sole trader or a partnership, then that's where you are likely to fall under the state-based legislation. But look, the principles that are in here today really do apply across the board in many respects. So there's a lot of similarities across the different sets of legislation. And non-trading corporations, so things like some clubs and things like that are not deemed to fall under it. But the vast majority of organisations, so if you're a proprietary limited, you'll be covered by the Fair Work legislation. And if you're not already a proprietary limited, that may be perhaps as your business continues to grow and expand, be somewhere you go in the future. Okay, so the big element that caught a lot of the headlines was the Secure Work Better Jobs, which also came through in December last year. That was on one of the final sitting days of Parliament. And the element that grabbed most of the headlines was actually around multi-employer bargaining. And so this is where employers may be compelled to bargain with other employers or organisations to negotiate terms and conditions, almost like a contract of employment. So this may have an impact on some small businesses. It may be that there might be, if you've got a small but growing entity within a niche sector, there may be some call from the unions or other parties to sort of bring this together, bring you together with other people. So if it does happen, then it's worth getting a little bit of guidance if you do get notified that you might be swept up in this. And sometimes it can be that there's people in a certain geographical location. So it might be that a group of people in Brisbane, there might be a group of workers that get together there, or Rockhampton, or wherever it might be. There's got to be a lot of similarities to actually bring people together. So if you've got a really unique business, if you're a cryptocurrency advisor or something like that, then you're not likely to get swept up in this. But if you are running the sort of business where you're involved in cleaning or other elements, it may be the NDIS, then there's a chance that you may get swept up in this at some point. This is very early stages of this legislation now. It doesn't come into effect until May. I think that the unions will be going for larger employers as part of this. So some of the big childcare groups, some of the big aged care groups, that's where there may be this multi-employer bargaining that's happening. And I'm just going to have a quick look on the chat here now before I go on to the next slide. So with that, with the Fair Work coverage, you said you could only see half of the slide. Not a problem on that one, because we will be, we've kind of talked through most of the elements on there. Just working to scroll down on the, oops, sorry, let me just get back into the questions here. And I'll be those in just a minute, just having a few little technical issues. Right, here we go, got it. I can see that, thank you, Debbie, for letting us know that the slides are not changing. You able to let me know what slide we're on now? Are we on the multi-employer bargaining one? Still on slide 11. Right, okay. Okay, now what I might do is I will quickly pause the presentation and we'll head back into that shortly. So just bear with me a moment while I reload these slides, and then you can see all that information coming through. It just takes a moment. One of the joys of working off a Mac. Right, let's see. Okay, give it a few moments to reload. So I'd love to know if you can pop up in the chat there now and let me know if you can see the current slide on multi-employer bargaining. Hopefully that's all okay for you there. Yes, it's changed. Oh, hooray! Thank you. Brilliant. That's great. Okay, then. Oh, so we can move on to our next slide, and hopefully this will all come through well for you. So looking at fixed term contracts. Fixed term contracts, and they're sometimes called limited duration, maximum term. There's a few different elements. The most common term is fixed term that's used. Up until now, there's been a lot of different cases that have flip-flopped around as to what you can do with a fixed term contract. And so with that, it's really important that you're aware that there's a limitation on the fixed term contracts. So you can't actually go beyond that 2-year period. There are a few exemptions. So if you are involved in an organisation where you are getting a government contract, let's say, and you've got a 2-year contract, then let's just see if I can get the screen going again. I can always view it within a PowerPoint if needed. So I might just expand that PowerPoint screen a little bit here. Hopefully you can see the slides in here. We'll just go the low-tech way now. I'll just scroll my way through, and I will just reshare. Small, and then fingers crossed it will all start working for you all. Okay. So if there's any problems, let me know. I've got a little preview that's popped up on mine that looks okay. Hopefully it's all right at your end. The other exemption for fixed term contracts, if you've got a really highly paid employee, so if they're getting paid over the Fair Work threshold, which is around about $170,000 a year, which could be unlikely in your business, then this exemption, there is an exemption for that. But for the most part, if you've got someone on a fixed term, let's say you've got a particular project or you're not sure on work demand, you're going to bring somebody in for 6 months, then usually that can be extended multiple times. You can extend it once, but then going beyond that's actually starting to get into difficult territory. So something to think about there. And that's something that is coming into effect soon. Pay secrecy is an interesting one. So up until now, people have been able to mandate that employees do not share any of their pay details with their fellow employees. There's always a leakage in organisations. There's always somebody who has a chit chat with others, who seems to know what everybody else is on. Sometimes it's correct, and sometimes it's not, because sometimes people don't necessarily share the most accurate information about their pays. But now employees do have a right to chat about their pay. They've got a right to ask, but an individual who's asked doesn't have an obligation to tell people what they're getting paid. And so you're unable to stop these sorts of conversations in the workplace now. And that's why I recommend to all organisations that you have a think about how you pay people. This is important from a wage theft perspective, and we'll get onto wage theft a little bit later, but also looking at it from a fairness and equity. So if you've got two people doing the same job, they should be getting paid the same amount, and it should be at least in line with the award. If you're just paying people based on what they've negotiated, or maybe you're paying people just based on what they had in their last job, unless you're able to justify a difference. So if you've got two admin people, one person's coming in, they've got 10 years experience, one person's actually a junior, they've just finished a course at TAFE, then you might be able to justify the difference in the salaries due to that level of experience and capability there. Whereas if really they're expected to perform the same work, then they should actually be on the same rate there. If you do have any issues, if you do have someone who's overpaid at the moment compared to their peers, there can be all sorts of weird and wonderful quirks of that happening, then it's worth having a look at freezing their pay until the increases of the rest of the team actually catch up from there. Now, another element of legislation that has changed is around anti-discrimination. So this now covers 3 new areas across the nation. And across Australia right now, there are lots of different state-based legislation. And so this was covered in some of the state-based legislation, but this actually now makes it Commonwealth law across the nation. So you are unable to discriminate on the grounds of breastfeeding, gender identity, and intersex status. And that is in addition to the existing laws. So the protected attributes, as it's called about, so are the following on this slide. So you can't discriminate on the grounds of race, colour, sex, sexual orientation, age, physical, mental disability, marital status, family or carers responsibilities, pregnancy, religion, political opinion, national extraction, or social origin. Now, there are times where you can actually legitimately discriminate. So if, for example, you have somebody like the gentleman on the side of the slide here who is wheelchair bound, and you have a role where you're going to be cleaning out gutters and you've got to climb onto roofs using ladders and things like that, then in a small business you would not be expected to go and get some fancy lifting gear that you can move around and things. It's just not reasonably practicable. So there are times where you can say, look, this person is unable to fulfill the inherent requirements of the role, and so that's not possible. If it was an admin role and you're just worried because there's a step outside the front of your building in your office, then you know what, you just need to find a way of having a ramp there. It's not very expensive. And so that's something that could be seen as a reasonable accommodation, along with perhaps might be a sort of a special ergonomic chair and things like that. So it wouldn't be huge amounts of expense there. Okay, so flexible work is another element in here that actually comes into effect in May. And this is something where the flexible work has been expanded out. So it's at the moment covering people usually with caring responsibilities for children, preschool, so people can have the right to request. And in the past, employers could just go, oh, I'm really sorry, I've had a think, but for business reasons, we're unable to accommodate it. That's no longer enough. Employers now need to give detailed reasons for refusal. So it may be, you've told me you'd like to come back to work on a job share. We've advertised for a part-time role for the days that you don't want to work or are unavailable to work. And so we've been unable to find a suitable person to fill in those hours. And this is for, let's say, a receptionist role. So it's really important that certain hours are filled for the organisation. And so we're unable to adjust your role back at this particular point in time. But if that person is unhappy with the reasons given, they can actually go to Fair Work, and the Fair Work Commission will make a call on whether or not that was reasonable grounds for refusal. So that's a new element. One of the elements that still stands that not everybody is aware of is that there is a need to respond within 21 days to any requests for flexible working. And it's 21 days. And so if you've got a time where perhaps you're the business owner and you're away on holiday, maybe you're taking a month off, then it's important that these sorts of things can still get communicated to you. So you can actually make a call on these sorts of things, even over the Christmas break. Sometimes time can just fly away. Maybe there's some sick days and things like that that sort of fall in with these crazy times we live in. And so it's easy for those 21 days to get missed. So just looking out for correspondence from employees. And it's good to actually, as a matter of course, really ensure that everything's dealt with within 21 days or less if you can. Okay, so that brings you through most of the very recent changes that have been talked about, and that sort of takes us through the first half of our presentation today, looking at those elements brought in by the Albanese government. There are a couple of quieter changes that haven't really hit the headlines, so it's important to share these with you just so that you're across them, because often in a business you're trying to do thousands of different things all at once, often working in the business as well as working on the business. You've got to look after your finances, your marketing, your sales, your HR. It's a multidisciplinary task that has many challenges. So this session today is really about bringing across all those latest changes, to be aware of those, and also looking at a couple of others. Now, when you bring on employees, it's really important that people are given copies of the National Employment Standards. And there's actually two different sets of National Employment Standards. There's one for your full-time, part-time employees, and then there's a separate one for casual employees. And this should be given to them as soon as they start work. Now, the National Employment Standards are good to also have on display. Strongly recommend you've got them up on a notice board, or even if you're working virtually with a team, if you've got some kind of a collective virtual poster board, then having it up on there, whether that's a Teams file, whether that's something that's on your SharePoint or your shared drive somewhere, so that people are aware of this information. It talks very much about the minimum standards. It's great to have as a ready reference tool for yourselves as well, just in case different queries come up in the workplace around compassionate leave or parental leave and different elements like that. Now, that requirement's been in place since the introduction of the Fair Work Act back in 2009, and then a couple of years ago, the separate National Employment Standards for casual employees came out. And those National Employment Standards are updated at the beginning of July, end of June every year, when the national minimum wage is set for the year ahead. And so it's got all the latest information. So if you're issuing this information, it's good to make sure you've got the most up-to-date copy. So they'll be releasing a new version of the National Employment Standards soon, which will also have the family and domestic violence leave changes. So up until recently, it was 5 days unpaid per 12 months for all employees, whereas that is now actually going to be coming out to paid leave. So it'll be 10 days paid leave across your full-time, part-time and casual employees for family and domestic violence leave. So for small businesses, so if you've got less than 15 employees, this doesn't come in until August. But if you're over that threshold and you've got more than 15, and that does include any part-timers, it's number of employees, not FTE, includes your casuals as well, then that means that February the 1st is your date of implementation there. There isn't a huge take up for this type of leave, so it's unlikely to be a big imposition in your business. But if the request ever comes through, then it's important that you're aware of what sort of supports are available. And generally, when people are in times of crisis, you can garner a lot of loyalty with employees where you're able to provide this kind of help and support. So it's a good way of actually retaining staff to make sure that you're doing the right thing by people and providing them with great support in this time where we've got some of the lowest levels of unemployment and highest levels of workforce participation in many, many years. Now, on the casual Fair Work information statement, and these are all able to be found. If you just put in casual Fair Work information statement in your search engine, it should pop up on that first page of results every single time. And so if you are employing casual employees, it's really important that you've got some kind of a monitoring system in place, because after every year of service, then that casual employee has actually got a right to request ongoing employment. You don't have to grant this. So if you're saying, right, okay, well, we are an agricultural business, we have very seasonal work here, there are big fluctuations. Yes, we think we might have more work for this person later this year, but we don't know how much and when. So if it's likely that the work is going to fluctuate a lot, if it's reasonably foreseeable that the work might come to an end, these are all reasons why you could reject a request for part-time or full-time ongoing employment. There are times where, because casual employees get that 25% loading, people might go, I just can't afford to go part-time or full-time. And so if people refuse, even though you're offering this to them, then it's well worth making sure that you've got this documented down. Either do a file note and save it on their file, or you could write them a letter where they actually sign off to say, I understand that that work is available to me on a full-time, part-time guaranteed hours basis, but I'm not going to go forward with that. Now, I've got some great questions there from Terry and Debbie. Thank you so much for those. They relate to the previous slide there. For the family and domestic violence leave, are there any exemptions for very small businesses? And that's a no. The only exemption is that if you're under the 15 employees, then that legislation isn't kicking in until August. So you've got a little bit more time there. The only wriggle room you have in the Fair Work Act is really under that 15 employee threshold. If you've only got one employee, it doesn't matter. If you've got 11, it's still the same rules across that level there. And as soon as you've got over that 15, then I just want to bet. Brilliant. And Debbie, great question there around proof of domestic violence leave, because of course, if somebody is going to be taking a form of leave, let's say they're taking compassionate leave, then you can actually ask for reasonable evidence. If people are taking personal leave, be that to care for another person or because they're unwell, you can ask for a stat dec, or you can ask for a doctor's note and suitable evidence from there. With family and domestic violence leave, then you could look at asking for reasonable evidence of this. So if somebody says, look, I'm going through a child custody situation right now, I've got to attend these court dates, then you can go, okay, that's great. Can you provide me with the information for those court dates so that I can make sure that we've got everything we need to make sure we pay you all of the elements that you're owed. So It is difficult because there will be times where perhaps that person has to move house at short notice. They might have got a copy of maybe a violence restraining order, maybe they've got a copy or a police number, things like that. But there may well be times where somebody's in crisis and it's really hard to get that kind of information from them. And so a little bit of tact might be needed at times, just to gently guide people through what's needed, and talk things through early on with people and just say, look, I really want to support you on this journey. I appreciate you've got some really difficult times ahead. You've got some annual leave you can use. There is domestic violence leave, but with the domestic violence leave, can you please give me some information around this, just so that I can make sure we've got everything all covered for the payment, and see what happens from there. Okay, so another big question for organisations is, should I be taking this person on as a contractor or an employee? And it is a tricky one. I have some clients who are working through this at this very point in time, and they're saying, okay, well, I want to take this person on as a contractor, and then I know they might, I can sense this level of frustration of me asking all of these questions about, okay, tell me a bit more about this contractor, because they just want to get a contractor's agreement out there. But I also don't want my clients to get into trouble by doing the wrong thing. And it's good to make sure that any worker relationships, be it contractor or employer, set up correctly right from the very start. So this is where you can get your QR code scanner all at the ready. So here is a Fair Work link. This will take you through to the page that talks about independent contractors versus employees. And with that, there's a number of different steps that are assessed in order to find out whether they're a contractor or an employee. Providing an invoice isn't enough. There needs to be more than that, because there have been examples of sham contracting, is how it's talked about in law. And there was this famous old case with a commissioner back about 15 years ago that goes, well, if it looks like a duck, it waddles like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck, even if you're calling it a chicken. So if you've got a contractor who has no control over their work hours or their work situation, they're not taking the risk, they're not having to provide tools and equipment, they can't subcontract or delegate to others, they're not in control of their hours of work, and they have an expectation of work continuing, even though you're paying them on invoice, then really they're most probably likely in a court of law to be deemed an employee. With this element here, this tick list actually helps to then go, okay, so let's have a look at the contractors I have right now. Do they have some freedom as to when that work is performed? And am I asking them to provide their own evidence of insurance, for example? And that covers off that risk box there. If you've got people saying, yep, okay, I've got my professional indemnity, public liability, those sorts of insurances in place, then that's great. And talking about that in an actual contract that you have with people, having a contract with your subcontractors is really important to help show we have made it clear right from the start what the relationship is all about. The expectation of work continuing, so that's something that should be covered off in your contract as well, the fact that there's no commitment to ongoing work, and these sorts of elements in there. The thing that I have most small business owners and leaders talking about is that ability to subcontract or delegate, because sometimes you're actually bringing in a subcontractor because you know them, you trust them, they've got specific skills that you want them to deliver, and you don't want them to just bring in their junior to do the job that you're doing, be that a construction task, be that care work, whatever it is. And so with that, you can't necessarily stop it, but the provision that I often talk about with people is you just talk about people need to actually ask for permission before bringing in somebody to delegate tasks to, or subcontracting and things like that, just so that those sorts of things can be worked through in advance. So the contractor versus employee is unfortunately quite a complex area, and so the Fair Work information is really succinct and clear. So under Fair Work, you can decide whether or not they are a contractor or an employee. So you can decide what contract to give them. Is it a contract of employment? Is it a contractor agreement? The ATO, as you can see, I've got a pretty similar list for determining is it a contractor or employee relationship. And again, we've got a QR code there that takes you through to a really handy page. Although there's a few, there used to be a really cool tool on the ATO website where you used to be able to go in there, put in all the details of your subcontractor, and it would actually pop out the little answer at the other end that you could print off and say, this person is unlikely to be deemed a contractor. That's been taken away now, sadly, due to a case last February that's muddied the waters around contractors or employees. So even the ATO struggle sometimes in defining this, but there's some really great information on that page. See, on Fair Work, if we just go back up a slide, it doesn't matter how the person's paid as to whether or not they can be deemed an employee, but the mode of remuneration, whether you're paying on an invoice or a payslip, does matter when you're looking at the ATO. Somebody might be deemed a contractor under Fair Work, but they might be deemed an employee under the ATO. Oh, gosh. So this is why it's good to actually reach out when you've got these sorts of situations. Because if they are found to be an employee under ATO but not Fair Work, that means that you might still need to pay superannuation to that individual. So there are a couple of other areas just to be aware of when you are engaging your subcontractors. One is work cover, workers' compensation. If you have regular people, if you've got a guy who comes in, who's fixing the electrics in your office and came in like 3 days over multiple periods last year, that person's unlikely to be deemed an employee. And so that sort of work cover element isn't so much there. If you have somebody who's doing regular work for your organisation, let's say you are running a podiatry practice and you've got 6 employees and you're also subbing some work out to a subcontract. They're actually doing podiatry work for you. They're not providing other guidance to your organisation. Then that's where making sure they're under the workers' compensation is a big thing to do, just in case. Payroll tax is another element, and this differs state by state. So it's worth actually having a look at your state legislation on this. So having a look at the Treasury or Finance Department for your state, because there's different definitions. So you might have somebody who, they're not an employee under Fair Work, they're not an employee under the ATO, but you might end up still paying payroll tax depending on what happens there. Okay, so we did touch on pay secrecy earlier, and I mentioned we're also going to have a look at wage theft. And so with that, there was good old George Columbaris, who is famous for his MasterChef exploits and also for his staff exploits, became infamous for that. And over in WA, we've got an interesting social commentary that comes courtesy of the Bell Tower Times. And so you can see they were quite cynical about George's return to Channel 10 with his new show, where he's talking about how he suffered because he failed to pay his staff properly. And a lot of people were going, well, you should have actually got things all organised. You were running a multi-million-dollar operation. There is a bit more leeway and forgiveness in smaller organisations where you haven't got a HR department, but there is likely to be change coming through around wage theft in the very near future. It's been talked about for some time. It's been talked about criminalising this. So if there is willful misconduct, and I've come across quite a lot over the years of organisations going, can't afford to pay the super for my employees, so I'm just not going to bother. You just can't do that. And soon those sorts of acts may well result in criminal penalties, so resulting potentially in jail time. To make sure you are doing the right thing, at the very least, all of your employees should be on the national minimum wage. There are trainee wages that are slightly different. There are sort of apprenticeship wages and scaling, sometimes for youth workers under awards, like in the retail space, for example. And so making sure that those minimums are paid is important. So running a check on your payroll at least once a year, just going, right, okay, let's have a look at what this person's receiving this role and this person in this role. Are we paying everything that isn't just the base hourly rate? It's also, if we're expecting somebody to be a first aider in the workplace, are we paying any first aid allowances that are applicable under the award? Are we paying the right overtime rates? Are we paying the right penalty rates for a public holiday? Have we looked at progression? Some awards have in there a stepped movement up front. Maybe someone comes in on a 2.1, then after 12 months they can move up to a 2.2, 2.3, so on and so forth. So it's worth looking at those sorts of things. When you're looking at the modern awards, and this information is defined more around the Fair Work Act, but it's also relevant if you're on a state-based system. So having a look at the industry or occupation. So if you have scientists in your organisation, I've got a small organisation, small client, and they've got some food scientists, so they actually fall under the Professional Employees Award, whereas there's other elements in their organisations. The clerical staff actually fall under the Clerks Private Sector Award, and so you can actually be covered by more than one award in even a small business. Due to the different occupations you have. And sometimes there is an industry award. So there's the Social Community Home Care Disability Services Industry Award, and that's actually really broad. So that means that somebody who is a care worker out in the community can be on that award, as well as somebody who's running a residential care setting, manager for people with disabilities is the same as the person who works on reception. It's really broad in its nature, a broad industrial one to sweep everybody in all over one. And the industry is a really important element to decide. And there was a case that went through a couple of years ago with Coles, where the Transport Workers Union were trying to say that the drivers should be under a drivers award, a separate award, whereas Coles were trying to say, no, they should actually be under the retail award because our industry is retail. And Coles were successfully able to say, yes, these people, even though they're driving trucks, work for a retail company, they are making deliveries exclusively for this retail store. So all interesting. So look at your industry first and then look at whether occupations will be different out of that one there. And with that, when you're looking at your minimum obligations, when you're thinking about potential for any issues, any wage errors to occur, have a look at what the national employment standards say, have a look at what your award says, have a look at what's in your policy or contract. Maybe you bought a business and you haven't realised that they actually allow all of their employees 30 days of annual leave, and you've got to accrue for that liability then within your organisation and abide by it. You can't just go, oh, we're just going to take it away. You can't make unilateral changes to a contract of employment. You can negotiate with people, and I've worked with one employer that was in a sticky financial situation where employees gave up 5 days of leave that they had over a shutdown period. Because the organisation was running at a loss at that point in time. We'd done the calculations, and this was actually worth tens of thousands of dollars each year in terms of that cost of leave. So there are times where you can negotiate with people, but it's not easy, and you do need to do it by agreement. So there are penalties for getting things wrong, and with that, discrimination claims in the workplace, where we went through those 3 new elements around the breastfeeding and the gender identity, for example, elements that have actually now come through under discrimination laws, and that great long list of age and gender and marital status and all of these other different elements that are actually covered under discrimination. So if there is a claim there, be very careful. Your penalties can be unlimited. Unfair dismissal claims, luckily, a little bit cheaper, but still, there's no such thing as cheap really under any penalties. So the claims are usually for the wages for the period unemployed, and any compensation related to direct losses suffered. And reinstatement can also quite often be a remedy. It's meant to be the first port of call in terms of resolving things. So Fair Work like to mandate that unless it's completely inappropriate. And an employer saying, we don't want that person back, is not enough. The Fair Work can actually go, tough, you've actually got to take them back. Even if you've recruited somebody into their place, it's just like, they'll go, that's not our problem. You actually did not fairly dismiss this person, and they're not to suffer a penalty. Adverse action is an interesting one. This penalty can be levied against employees and organisations. The current penalty units are 13,200, and you can actually get multiple penalty units for a breach, goes up to 66,000. Organisations doing the wrong thing can be having to pay this as well as individuals. And so if you've got somebody in your organisation who, despite, let's say you've got a manager who's running your business in one particular area, and you've given them guidance and advice or even instructions to do a certain thing. We need to do everything by the book. We need to do everything lawfully. You need to seek advice. And they've gone, oh no, it's too expensive, I'm just going to sack them. And they might have, there might be other complexities that have meant that person exercised a workplace right. And so then they can say, I was sacked because I tried to claim parental leave, or I made a complaint. And there can be other elements swept in there. And of course, it isn't just the penalties that Fair Work or other court jurisdictions, such as industrial relation commissions, can levy against you. It's also the cost of paying your law bills, your legal bills. I've got a client, we did everything right with a adverse action claim. Somebody put in the claim and had a look at what the legal costs were going to be, and it was actually going to be more expensive to defend the case than it would have to just pay this person out. So that organisation paid out tens of thousands of dollars of go away money to this person. And it was the opportunity loss was the other big issue. Is during that time, very senior members of the organisation were caught up in defending this case in the early stages before they decided to negotiate a settlement. So that was a distraction that the organisation didn't need. And there's nothing you can do to prevent people from putting in a claim. Your best defence is just to do the right thing in the first place. Now, keeping up to date, it may seem that there's a huge amount out there of changes. So you can register for Fair Work, and it's one of those things of once you start familiarising yourself with the website, and if, of course, you are a sole trader partnership or so on and so forth in Western Australia, or otherwise not covered by the Commonwealth legislation in your jurisdiction, then find out if they've got some updates and have a good trawl through their website. There are employment law update sessions. This one that we're running today, if you've got anybody in your network who you think may benefit, then we are actually running another one in a week on Tuesday. We'll be running a session, so feel free to invite them along to that. Also, law firms. So if you have engaged with a law firm in the past, it might be worth reaching out to see if they actually run any regular sessions. Often they're free to attend. They often put on some catering as well, so you actually do get a free breakfast out of the law firm as well. They're often early morning, and so these sessions can be good for understanding situations, and you can actually also get your key questions asked. The ATO also run webinars on a range of different business, payroll, compliance topics, and so that can actually help out with your obligations there. And if you've got any unique situations that are going on in your organisation, and we'll have a couple of minutes for questions in a moment, so feel free to get typing in the Q&A or chat box. You can actually book a session with an ASBAS advisory, so you can book sessions with myself, or there may be other people on the team that can give you information that's in relation to your specific situation. Okay, so we've got an anonymous question that came in, and it is a brilliant question. And please type away your questions if there's any more coming through, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask them as well. So the question is it possible that some particular job classifications are not fitting the coverage clause of any award? Yes. It is. Where that happens, then the minimum rate that you need to pay is the national minimum wage. And so with that, let's say you're, a role as a HR manager in an organization is typically an award-free role. And so the national minimum wage level would be the minimum lawfully. But in order to actually attract somebody good into that role, you've also got to start looking at market rates. And if you're going to be paying, $20 an hour, you're not going to get a very good HR manager in Australia right now. So there's quite a few different classifications. There's over 120 modern awards. So most occupations are covered. It's mainly around the professional kind of services, office-based. There's also some unusual new types of roles out there that are not really covered. Marketing tends to be a function in organisation that covers things. And yes, the miscellaneous award does exist, but that isn't a catch-all for all sorts of other different elements. It is worth actually reverting back to that miscellaneous award. If you've had a look through all of the applicable awards in your most likely in Fair Work, or it might be in your state jurisdiction. If you've had a look through those 120 odd modern awards on Fair Work, have a look at the miscellaneous ones, see if it applies. There's when you read an award, it's normally item 3 to show how much time I've spent on all these awards. Actually, it's called classification, and it will talk about who is included in that particular award and also exclusions. So if you're looking at the Disability Services Award, then it will usually talk about the fact that it excludes the Aged Care Award and things like that, because there are specific information relating to those in other places. Okay, hopefully that answers your question. And so we have hit 11 o'clock already. So just give you one more moment to type away any questions in the chat box there, in the Q&A box, or even unmute yourself. Okay, I can't see anything coming through at the moment. But like I said, feel free to reach out to NASBA's advisor for more information. Feel free to reach out to those other potential sources of information too. And feel free to go back through this presentation again when you get the recording, so that you can actually scan those QR codes if you didn't get a chance to already, so you can get all that information at your fingertips. So thank you so much, Yanga Nanuk, for joining me today. Hope your business journey in 2023 goes really, really well. Wishing all of you all the very best, and take care, and thank you so much.